In today's episode of Locked On Pistons podcast, we are joined by Omari Sankofa, Detroit Pistons beat writer for the Detroit Free Press, to discuss the Detroit Pistons' reputation and their rotation this upcoming season. Stay tuned for all of that in today's episode of Locked On Pistons podcast.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I'm your host, Ku Cahill. You can find me over on Twitter at Ku Cahill. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. And today's episode is sponsored by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. You'll hear a little bit more about GameTime later. But I want to introduce you guys to Omari. Thank you for joining the podcast, man. I appreciate it. Before we get started, I just got to ask you, how do you feel about being the longest tenured beat writer now?
Man, it's pretty crazy. Well, appreciate the welcome. And yeah, that's pretty crazy because this is about to be year 5 for me covering the Pistons and year 7 for the NBA as a whole. So like 5 years is not a long time, but then you say longest tenure, and it's like, man, so it'll be a fun season, right? A lot of new coach, new front office, same players from last year, but I think it'll be a fun season. So obviously media days on Monday and we'll get started.
So how do you feel that people are going to start referencing you as like the old head now? Like when you came around, I believe Rod was on the first season, right? For you, Rod was still here.
Rod was still on the beat, and he was the old head at that point. I think he made it 9 years before he left.
So, and now James gone, Rod's gone. Now Omari, he is the lone wolf now. So let's go ahead and get into today's episode, though. So the Pistons' reputation is something that has come up the last few days because Jaylen Brown of the Boston Celtics had some interesting comments referencing the Pistons, and we're going to play it here, and you guys will be able to hear what exactly it is that he said. Stay tuned, listen to this, and then we'll comment on it afterwards.
Means that sacrifice where, in a night we plan, don't mean to disrespect them, but the Detroit Pistons, who have struggled over the last year or two, we're going to play through Peyton, let him go for 30. And play through Sam, let him shoot 10 threes tonight. We're going to still win the game. It don't have to be the normal way, but that gives those guys confidence. It gives those guys ability to run free, and we're going to need that down the line.
All right, Omari. So let's go ahead and take that off. So I was at quite a few games this past year. I don't show up for any away games, but I was credentialed for quite a few home games. Also, I'm apologizing for my voice, everybody. I am still feeling pretty sick, but I'm fighting through it. But I was at a few home games. You, however, are at almost every home game, almost every away game. Can you speak to this? When you're going to other cities and the Pistons are playing other teams, or even when they're coming to the Little Caesars Arena, do you get the sense, or do you hear anything? Do you have any stories, players on the court talking crazy, like just overall about the Pistons' reputation?
Honestly, nothing out of the usual. Whenever it's a road environment, it's going to be hostile regardless of how good or bad you are. And, we've talked about it on our pod over at the Pistons Post. Check that out if you haven't, with Motor City Hoops. But Pistons fans were really dedicated last season. I mean, they still had pretty decent attendance numbers. I think they were around middle of the pack in the NBA. And if the Lakers or, whoever came to town and it's a big game or it's a weekend night game, the arena was pretty packed. And if anything, it was more so home fans wanting the team to be accountable, right? Like they would boo during the losing streak, but at times it was just like, come on, like perk up, like it was definitely clear that they still had support from the home crowd despite all the struggles. So Jaylen Brown, obviously he kind of dissed him right there, but I would say overall, the team's been bad for a while. I think fans, at this point kind of know what it is, but at the same time, you have Cade, you have guys that fans can look forward to seeing growing up and hopefully turning this thing around. So yeah, last season was interesting just because you would expect LCA to be empty by the end of the year, given how the season went, but fans were still there. I think Pistons fans really want to watch a winner, and I didn't really get that type of feel at all. The only thing you really hear fans say that's disrespectful is when it comes to sports gambling. Like they'll yell out stuff about parlay and this and that, and that's probably the only time it gets like, it's like, come on, man. But beyond that, I really didn't notice anything that was outside the usual.
I mean, so Jaylen Brown isn't the first player, opposing player that is, to like kind of take a shot at the Pistons within last year. Like there's a few players I think that liked either Instagram posts or something, but making fun of like the Wingstop thing, how it was getting farther and farther away from all that stuff, that whole promotion. You had Kyle Kuzma say you just don't want to be that team, and referencing the team that actually loses to the Pistons because of the losing streak. Now you got Jaylen Brown saying, hey, we basically let our bench warmers eat against teams like the Pistons because we're still going to beat them anyways. And it just got me thinking, man, it's been, like you mentioned, they've been pretty bad for a long time. And this was once like you grew up in Michigan, you grew up around the team. Like this was once a very proud and respected franchise. And it feels like a few days ago, I realized, man, it's been 15, 20 years since like that going to work team was really around. And ever since then, it kind of feels like each year the Pistons have done more and more and more to kind of lose that, that respect that was gained across the NBA, across the NBA fan bases and all of that. And it's just, I think it's tough to see for fans that this is, and there's no real like rebuttal that you can have. Like, what are you going to say back? Like, hey, we won't win 14 games again. We'll win 20. Like there's that much of a rebuttal they can have. So I just think it's interesting. With a few games that I was at, I'll tell you this upcoming year, if I have to show up at a game and I see a player blow a kiss at a player after making a shot again, or like Tyrese Halliburton straight up laughing and dancing in the face of somebody after he hits a three and they're just like clowning. I don't know, man. I just feel like over the last few years, there's been a little bit more clowning that goes on during games, even on like opposing teams' benches when they play the Pistons.
Yeah, well, you got to win games. The 28-game losing streak took on the life of its own. You mentioned Wingstop and the memes and everything. I have people who never text me about basketball, like, what is going on with the Pistons? And I'm just like, I'm like, I know I'm the reporter, but this is all a surprise. You don't expect things like that. So, I mean, again, it wasn't too much out of the normal. I noticed last season, but with that, you win 14 games, you're naturally going to be a target, not just for fans, but for opposing players as well. I mean, they pay attention to that stuff. They're going to get jokes off and whatnot. I know Pistons fans kind of latched on to Kuzma saying you don't want to be that team when they did eventually beat the Wizards over at their place. But people keep tabs on that stuff. I think a lot of it's probably in good fun, but obviously it's not fun being on the other end of that. But bottom line for the Pistons is they just have to get better. The only way you can really quiet that is to win more games, and you certainly hope after last season, or they certainly hope that 14 wins is as bad as it gets.
So before we move on, what do you think they can do? Like, is it just as easy as or as simple as just win more? Is it like to turn their reputation around? Because I feel like it's kind of, I don't know, over the last few years, you may feel differently, but I kind of feel like it's gotten to a point where, their reputation, I've heard like over the last few years, potentially like some players just like, hey man, we're not going to go play for Detroit because of what's going on over there. Like, is it just as simple as win more games, or is there other cultural things you feel like they need to do to kind of get that reputation back as, this is a team that has 3 championships. And again, like just 10, 15 years ago, was one of the most respected franchises in the entire NBA. So is this just as simple as start winning more games, or is there other things they could do?
It's that simple. Win more games. Winning cures all. Winning makes big fractures feel small, and it heals small fractures. Like if you're losing games, everything is going to feel a lot worse than it actually is. If you're winning games, everything is going to feel better. I think that's the bottom line. And at the end of the day, this is a team that's had, I believe, one winning record since 2008. Like I was in 8th grade last time they won the playoffs, and you just mentioned I'm longest tenured beat writer now, turned 30 this year. Like it's been like I've had like a whole life take place since the Pistons last won a playoff game. So you just have to win. That's all Pistons fans want, is to watch a winner, at the very least a respectable team, but obviously a winner. This is a franchise that's got 3 championships. They're 20 years removed away from their last one. You still have plenty of fans who remember the glory days. I mean, our family who remember the glory days. So just win. That's all it is. If they win games, I think all of that will no longer be an issue.
Yeah, and Trajan kind of mentioned at his press conference as well, his introductory one. He mentioned about the culture, and Tom Gore has actually mentioned a lot about having a good culture from top down and trying to change the way the organization was being ran, top to bottom, and kind of be all in lockstep and just have that kind of culture trickle down. And I think that kind of stuff does trickle down to the locker room and down to the court. So win more games, be more structurally sound as an organization, and just be more together with what you're doing and building that right environment. I think that will translate to not only more respect, but obviously more wins for the Pistons, and hopefully more good times for Pistons fans. Coming up, I want to talk about the Pistons rotation. Keith Langlis of Pistons.com just wrote an article today that talked about what the starting lineup and rotation could look like. So I want to get Omari's thoughts on that when we come back. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the NFL season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. I've told you guys this many times. A few years ago when betting became legal in Michigan, I didn't know where to go. I didn't know anything about it. Never tried it before. Tried out FanDuel, and I have not turned back since. Not only is it super easy to use, super self-explanatory, but most importantly, super fun to use as well. So again, go check out FanDuel. Get started today. You'll have a $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on. That's another great way to support the podcast. I do want to say for everyone that tuned into like the initial first live we had, I want to apologize for, again, I'm not feeling too well. This is take 2 of our live with Omari. I messed up the beginning intro, but we keep it trucking around here, so we're all good. All right, Omari. So one of the things I think is everyone's going to be watching for in the preseason, and everything people are going to be watching, not just preseason, but obviously training camp that's going to get started here relatively soon, is what the starting lineup's going to look like, and what is the rotation going to look like with a new head coach and a relatively similar roster, but with different veterans. I would say you still have the same like important pieces, just different. You kind of like rotated out the vets from last year with different vets. So there's been a lot of talk about who's going to start, who's going to be in the rotation. Is it going to be 10 deep, 9 deep? Who's going to close? Like, I think that's one of the main things people are watching for. And Keith Langlis of Pistons.com wrote an article. He named it, or the title of it is, how does JP Bickerstaff balance Pistons starting and bench units? I mean, there's just a few quick sentences I want to read from this, and I want to get your thoughts on the starting lineup and their possible rotations. But I want to read what he had to say real quickly. Just like I said, a quick few sentences. First sentence I want to point out, I thought this was a cool one. Pistons fans might recall the fury that ensued when Michael Curry had to decide who among Rip Hamilton and Allen Iverson would start and which one would have to deal with the apparent stigma of being labeled a bench player. I think there's a reason why he brought that up, and we can bring that up a little bit later. But he goes on in the article to talk about how Cade, Jalen Duren, Tobias seem to be the only real locks to be in the starting lineup. And he went on to talk about why he believes that Asar probably will end up in there because of defensive reasons. And he talks about Malik Beasley and another shooter starting next to him, which obviously means Jaden Ivey was not included in this. And this is the last sentence I want to read. I want to get your thoughts. Keith writes, quote, "The obvious omission from that unit is Jaden Ivey, but with no clear backup point guard on the roster, Ivey could be well ticketed for that role. And the Pistons will also want to provide Ivey, who has shot 34.3% and 33.6% from the three-point arc in the last 2 seasons, with the same type of shooting that a lineup with Beasley and Harris would give Cunningham. Bickerstaff can actually give Ivey even more shooting with a unit that starts with Isaiah Stewart at center." So, Omari, where do you stand right now on what the starting lineup you believe is going to look like? I had a few listeners actually reach out to me and say, I have a different starting lineup. You have a different starting lineup. Bryce has a different one. James had a different one before he went to New York. Like, everyone, from what my listeners have told me, we're all on different pages with the starting lineup. So where are you at?
It's a good question. Where am I? Yeah, I mean, Cade and Tobias, I think, are the 2 easy calls, right? Cade's Cade. You just paid Tobias to come here, and he's a professional bucket getter, which obviously is something that they really need. So those 2 are simple. Duren, you would like to give them that, although I'm intrigued just because Isaiah Stewart can shoot the ball. He's a little bit ahead offensively. So I do want to wait till camp before I, like, quote unquote, lock that one in. Duren, I mean, he averaged a double-double last season. He had the, assist numbers and everything, and he was really good. But, JB, he's always had good defensive bigs. And I'm just curious to see, where Duren is, for one, on that end of the floor compared to last season. And then 2, what JB prioritizes there, whether it's, if the defense isn't there, right? Do you want the rim running and rebounding and whatnot, or are you going to prioritize still being a little bit more solid on defense and then the floor spacing as well? Because that would also open the door for Asar to potentially start if you do have spacing at the 5. So Cade, Tobias for sure. You bring up Jaden Ivey, and I've written about it too. The way the roster is constructed, he has to be the backup point guard. That doesn't mean he has to come off the bench. You could obviously stagger him and Cade, but that's the big question because kind of like Duren in his defense, I question J.I. and where the shooting's going to be. Like if he could really, really shoot the ball, then he probably plays off of Cade pretty well. Or if he's improved defensively, he plays off of Cade pretty well. You start them together, and then you maybe sub Cade or Ivy out, after 8 minutes or whatever, start and close games with them. If he's still working on those aspects of his game, then do you just stagger him and Cade as much as you can and let Ivy sort of work the offense, give him those reps, give him those chances to grow? So Ivy, I think, is a really interesting player coming in just because it's a new regime. This isn't a regime that drafted him, but he's entering year 3, a year away from extension eligibility. And out of anybody else on this roster, he's certainly a guy that could be that number 2 next to a Cade Cunningham if everything clicks. So if he doesn't start, then you're looking at a Malik Beasley or Tim Hardaway Jr. probably at that point, more than likely, and both of those guys could really, really shoot the ball. But I think Jaden Ivey's a more dynamic presence just with his downhill ability. So with him, it's just what else can you do, right? Could he finish more shots at the rim? Could he knock down more threes? Could he take defensive pressure off of Cade? And kind of like Duren and Isaiah Stewart, I think those are questions that you figure out during camp. And then you have small forward. I passed Omari Sankofa there all summer. I was really impressed in the 16 or so games he played last season. Shot the ball really well, really solid defensively, keeps his head up, moves the ball. Just a pretty prototypical modern 3 in my eyes. But again, we've talked about Asar, him being the best perimeter defender on the roster. And this team just has depth. Like they have a little bit more wing depth than I think they've had in past seasons. So there are going to be some camp battles. So I did not give you a starting 5, I realize. But if I had to give one right now, I would just say Cade. I'm still going to give Ivy the nod, Fontecchio, Tobias, and then Duren. That's my prediction.
All right, so yours is a little bit different than mine, but I don't want to stay too much on my starting lineup. I want to move into something else I want to talk about with yours. But my starting lineup, what I would do would be Cade, Asar, Simone, Tobias, and Duren. I think that gives you the perfect blend of spacing, defense on the floor. I think it would make the wing rotation a little bit awkward, obviously, because you probably have to sub one of them out early, get them back in to start the second quarter. Kind of how you were referencing if you wanted to run Ivy and Cade in the starting lineup. You get one of them out early and just have them come back in and run backup point guard. But I don't want to really talk about my starting lineup too long. My listeners have heard me talk about that quite enough over the last few months. What I want to talk about is, you referenced how Jaden Ivey's kind of the X factor here. There's a point that Keith mentioned in his article that I think is actually a really good point. I just want to know where you stand with this. Over the last year, it feels like that Pistons fans believe, or there's a section of Pistons fans that do believe, that Ivy has looked better when Cade's not on the floor. And that Ivy has looked better in games where Cade hasn't been around. Or obviously his rookie year when Cade was gone the whole year. Ivy, had the ball in his hands a lot. He had the ball in his hands basically all the time. He was able to do whatever. When Cade missed games or he was off the floor this past year, obviously it was Ivy's show to run unless, Killian was out there and they waived him at the deadline. So he had that whole second half of the season by himself basically when he was on the floor. Overall, what I'm trying to say is Keith brought up, how it should be of importance to give Ivy the same amount of spacing that they're trying to give Cade if you want the ball in their hands. And that, giving Cade spacing obviously will help him a ton. And we've talked about that for a long time. But it could be the same thing for Ivy. It's just giving him spacing and a lineup that he could run could be what's best for him as well. So with that, I want to ask you, do you believe that should be something that they're prioritizing? Should it be, getting Ivy like his own lineup to run with spacing? Or should the priority be, look, we drafted this guy to play next to Cade. We need to find out, can he play with Cade Cunningham? We need to know if he can be that duo. Which one do you think should be higher on the priority list here?
Honestly, I think it's, check all. You're coming in with a new president, Trajan Langdon, who, still really getting to know these guys in their games, right? And part of the reason why I have Cade and Ivy starting is because you need to see what Ivy looks like next to Cade, obviously, because Cade's the franchise player, just got paid the maximum money, so he's going to be here for a while. And, Ivy hasn't gotten to that point yet, right? So you want to see if he can play with the franchise player. I think that's pretty straightforward. But then you have the stagger, and if you take Cade out after 8 minutes and Ivy, he gets at least 6 minutes in the first quarter, of running the offense on his own, then you can see how he operates with spacing around him. You can put Malik Beasley next to him, Tim Hardaway, Isaiah Stewart in that second unit, space the floor out as wide as possible, make it easy for him to make the correct reads. And Ivey's interesting because I feel like after 2 years, we still haven't really answered these questions, right? Cade missed his freshman year. And then last season, coming off the bench and just his role shifted so much that he never really got any consistency down. So I think coming in, you have to figure out as much as you can. Who is Jaden Ivey? Is he best with the ball? Is he best without the ball? Even if he's best with the ball, can he do enough without the ball when Cade's on the floor to still justify playing them together? And you need a lot of data going into next summer because you're going to have to figure out if you want to play Ivey now or, wait till next summer or what the best move there is. So by starting Ivey and Cade together, that's probably the quickest path to figuring those things out, especially if you have questions about if Ivey is still like a quote unquote point guard after camp and preseason and whatnot. But it's really just about reps for him. I think Cade, he's not he's going to get better, but we know what type of player Cade is, right? Like there's not as many mysteries with him. With I think it's just playing time, clear road from day one, and just giving him a variety of tasks and figuring out, okay, he's on ball, he's off ball, he's this or that, and this is how we're going to plan for him going forward.
To wrap up this segment, I want to ask you this. The Pistons have a roster spot they could still use. Do you think they end up going after a backup point guard? Because I think everyone I've talked with, from what I've heard and what I've read from everybody, everyone seems to be, I'm on the same page, penciling in Ivey as the backup point guard. And that just seems like the most seamless fit. You start a Malik Beasley or Tim Hardaway Jr. next to Cade, give him a bunch of spacing, and you just let Ivey run backup point guard. It seems like even if you stagger them, it seems like, okay, Ivey's going to be the backup point guard. That seems to be like where everyone's pushing him into being because of how the roster is. Do you think there's a chance that they may sign a backup point guard before the start of the season? Or do you think that this is what it is? Ivey's going to be the backup point guard, and they're going to, whether it's bringing him off the bench to be the backup point guard, maybe they stagger him perfectly with him and Cade where they're always on the floor at the same time. Just what do you think that's going to look like? Do you think there's a chance they bring in one?
I do think there's a chance because, for one, even if Ivey proves to be everything you want in a backup behind Cade as a point guard, you're still pretty thin at the position. If Ivey sprains an ankle or, Cade jams a pinky or whatever, you need to send him a game. Who is going to be that second point guard then, right? Is it Malik Beasley? Is it Asar? Do you just run a lot of stuff out of Duran? I'm not really sure. So I see a scenario where their hand is just kind of forced. You still have Dennis Smith Jr. out there. You have Markelle Fultz out there. You have a couple of guys who could come in, pretty steady. Dennis Smith, his defense, I think, would be a pretty big lift for this team. And just from an insurance standpoint, I think that makes sense. So my question is more so, does their hand get forced at some point just because there's some sort of injury or maybe they don't have enough confidence in Ivey having the ball in his hands? If something just forces their hand before opening night, because otherwise it probably does make sense to have that roster spot just from a flexibility standpoint. So for me, it's just depth. I mean, if you don't feel like you could cut it with 2 point guards and you sign a third one and then you just keep it pushing. So I do think there's a chance that they do.
Yeah, I agree. I think they 100% should get one. Even if they want to play Ivey as a backup point guard, that's fine. But you have to brace yourself for what happens throughout preseason training camp. It's like, okay, Ivey's not built to be the backup point guard because there's differing opinions of whether he's a point guard or an off guard right now. So no one really, like you mentioned, no one really knows what Ivey is yet. So if you get through training camp and preseason, that bigger staff's like, I don't really trust Ivey to run a backup point guard. You don't really have another option. So just to have the option in case that's how it goes, you need to have it. And they don't really have it on the team right now. So I definitely think they need to at least have, like you mentioned, a break safe here. We got someone reliable here, whether it's Dennis Smith Jr., Markelle Fultz, former Piston D Rose was just released. I don't know if that's something that they would be interested in. There's guards on the block that they could get just for, insurance policy. So I do think they should go after one before the training camp, but we'll see what they do. When we come back, I want to talk to Omari about Cade's expectations and rankings going into the year and what it should look like after the year. GameTime is the best place for me to go to purchase tickets because I'm a procrastinator. I wait to the last second with quite literally everything. And oftentimes it screws me over while I'm trying to buy tickets. I get a bad price ticket. I get a bad seat. I end up regretting it. But with GameTime, you get the last minute deals all the way up to the start of the event and sometimes even after the event starts. And along with this, if you go into GameTime, you can see what the seat looks like within the app. No longer buying the ticket, get in there and be like, oh, I shouldn't have got this ticket. This seat isn't that great. With GameTime, you can see exactly where your seat's at and what it looks like within the app. Along with this, you have the lowest price guarantee, or GameTime will credit you 110% of the difference. Also, your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Download GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download GameTime today. What time is it? Game time. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. All right, Omari. So over the last few days, we've seen a lot more NBA rankings coming out. Excuse me. And I saw a CBS ranking that had Cade 29th, or not 29th, 39th in the NBA. And then there was another ranking that had him 49th in the NBA. So that got me thinking, like, where should Cade be ranked heading into the season? And what would be like an acceptable, like, after the season, looking back and being like, okay, this guy ranked around here, and that was a successful season. That's what we wanted to see out of him. So I guess we'll start with, where do you feel like Cade is kind of, where do you feel like Cade's hovering around at right now? Where do you feel like his play, him as a player, his respect level, just where do you think he's at right now?
I think the 40-50 range is fair. Obviously he didn't have the most efficient rookie season, but he still showed a lot of what he could do. Missed his second year last year, was an improvement across the board, averaged about 23, 7.5 assists, 45, 36, 87 splits. I think that's firmly a top 50 player. That's what his ranking suggests right now. And what's tough about these rankings is that guys obviously benefit or don't benefit for whatever team they play on, right? So if Cade played for a better team, you may look at top 35 already. There's going to be some sort of knock or some sort of you have to account for the fact that they won 14 games last season. So I think him being top 50 coming into the year is a pretty solid ranking compared to what he did last season. At the end of the year, if he improves from last season, and I have his numbers here now, but you carve off the first 18 games last year, he was coming off the shin and playing himself back into shape. Over his last 45 games or so, those percentages increased to 47% overall, 37% from three. His assists went up slightly, and his turnovers went down. So he's dishing more than 2 assists for every turnover, 23 points, efficient. He's doing a lot of what you want to see in a lead point guard. So if that's who he is next season, like an efficient 23 and 7 or 8 guy, that's a top 35 player in my eyes. And if the Pistons get better with that, then at that point, maybe you're talking about top 30. This is a guy that can really make an impact. And, whether he's Jokic level or whatever, at the very least, he's certainly a guy that can be a best player on a good team. I think you want to come away from this season feeling pretty good about it.
So I talked about this on like 3 episodes ago. I spoke about what I believe the Cade Cunningham's checklist, what his goals should be for this upcoming year. And reading comments and reading what Pistons fans have to, are feeling about Cade, I feel like one of the main things I'm seeing is Cade just signed this max contract. He was the number 1 overall pick. Team just won 14 games. It's time for him to show us something. It's time for the team to show us something, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So coming off this past season and signing that contract, what do you think are like realistic expectations for fans to want to put on him? Fans who have been suffering losing for a long time now. We're told that this guy was your savior. You got him with the number 1 overall pick. You signed him to this max contract. Now there's a lot of fans, obviously, that want to put expectations on. So what do you think fans who feel that way, who went through the losing and want to see this thing turn around, Cade entering into year 4, basically year 3, but year 4, what do you think are fair expectations for fans like that to have for him?
For him to be a rock, right? For him to be the good player he is every single night. I think if there's one frustration people have had, and I can't speak for fans, like I know there's a variety of opinions out there, but just maybe the lack of consistency. You look at his rookie year and a lot of people were, questioning the efficiency. Is he just a guy who hunts shots and gets a lot, like exactly what is that, right? Like, what do you make of that? And a lot of rookies come in and are not efficient, obviously, so that's not a knock on Cade, but that's what people think. He's the number 1 pick, and when you're the number 1 pick, some people are going to hold you immediately to LeBron expectations. And if you're not LeBron, some people are going to be immediately disappointed. So I don't know what I would say, honestly. Like, I don't know what I would say to him, but I would just say that, from Cade's standpoint, I think it is that consistency. You had a full off season of just work, right? No rehab. It's not like last year where you had to get back into shape. I know when we talked to him at the end of the year, he talked about his conditioning being a pretty big point of emphasis for him. And I think we've seen some of that in the past, him getting worn out playing both ends of the floor. So just being that rock every single night, even if the team's losing, if you're a fan and you're a skeptic or, you're not quite sold on what's being built, but Cade's being that consistent player every night, making the right plays down the stretch, you still probably feel at least good that they have somebody that can help turn this thing around, right? And I think for Cade, it's just next year is a solidify season. Solidify yourself as a top 30, 35 player. Solidify who you are as a player. I think, again, like the last 45 games last year, especially around December, he just really, really started cooking, right? And he has some nights where nobody can slow him down. So he has to get closer and closer to being that player every single night. And the closer he gets, I think the better, maybe some people in the fan base will feel about him being that guy.
And to buffer your point a little bit, I've talked with some people that have referenced that he spent a lot of time this offseason working on his explosion, working on his conditioning, and just like you mentioned, he got worn out a lot towards the end of games. He really put in emphasis on getting some of that explosion for around the rim finishes and all that kind of stuff, but also his conditioning to last longer and be able to go both sides of the floor. So I know that was something he worked on heavily this offseason. We'll see if it pays off. I feel like for Pistons fans, what I think should be realistic expectations for Cade, and it's tough because look, this team won 14 games this past year. Like, everyone is aware of like how bad this team was this past year. In this offseason, they didn't really make like any big changes. They just kind of rotated out vets. Now, the vets may be better than previous veterans, and the roster may work itself out to where you can like the coaching staff can craft out better functioning lineups than last year. But even still, like it's not like you made any crazy changes to the team. It's not like any big addition was added. So just how much better can you expect a 14-win team to get without making any big changes? That's the question I have. You don't see that many teams go from worst in the NBA to like 20-plus wins. It just doesn't happen, especially without a big change. So it's tough for me to, kind of put these expectations, what are realistic ones. I've kind of landed at just the Pistons should be playing competitive games in March. Like, you shouldn't be seeing guys get shut down for injuries in March or, in April. Like, you should be seeing the Pistons play meaningful games around that time, fighting for a play-in spot. And if they don't make the play-in, okay, I mean, so be it. But they should be at least competing for it at that point in the season. And they should be able to see, fans that is, they should be able to see their favorite players, Cade and Ivey and Asar or Duran or Tobias, whoever, playing minutes at the end of March, at the beginning of April. They should be able to see those guys playing in games that actually matter for something. So that's what I would put the expectation that Cade needs to get them to that point. How realistic that is, I just need to see how it goes because, again, I mean, they won 14 games and they didn't make any crazy additions. That's why it's just hard for me to kind of pencil in what this team is going to be. But that's where I land with it. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you this just real quickly, and then we'll wrap it up. Just like, you don't even have to spend long on it at all. Just what's your quick expectations for the team this year?
Is it behind them? Yeah, like to be competitive, just wash out the bad taste of last season. I think, like, again, just from talking to people, a lot of people are like, what's going on with this team, right? Like, how does it collapse to that extent, which you don't usually see? I mean, a 28-game losing streak obviously is pretty ridiculous. So, next season, just wash the taste of last season out of your mouth. I think Cade being the guy he needs to be, but really more importantly for next season, it's not about Cade, it's about everybody else. You've had all these lottery picks come in, Jalen Duran, Jaden Ivey, Sar Thompson. Those guys are really going to be the keys to the season. Those guys improving is what's going to take this thing from where it's at to that next step where you can see a 15 to 20 game improvement, because now you have, Duran being one of the league's better rim protectors, or you have Ivey coming into his own as sort of a combo guard who can do whatever you need him to do on any given night. At some point, you have to stop being a young team. You have to mature. You have to figure out how to win. And that just comes with more experience. So I think you want to see, you have guys going into year 4, Isaiah Stewart's in year 4, Cade's, and Stewart's in year 5. And Cade's in year 4, you have guys that who are going to be in year 3. You can't look like a team that doesn't know what it's doing forever. At some point, you have to grow up. You have to execute. You have to know where you're supposed to be on defense, like all that stuff, right? We haven't really seen that in the past few years, but you just got to grow up and, show that you know what it takes to win. And if you can't do that for next season, then maybe you start asking deeper questions about the core and who you need to build around. But it's a young team. It's been a young team. You want to see them grow up. You want to see them be more competitive. And I don't know how many more wins that adds, whether it's 24 or 30 or whatever it may be. But if you're in a playoff or play in conversation after the trade deadline, then you've probably checked most of those boxes. So you just have to get better. I wouldn't put a number on it. Just, you can't be last season. You have to show that you're growing up. You're leaving the first stage of a rebuild behind. You're competing on defense, all that small stuff that the veterans do. You have to get closer to that next season. And I think that's going to define, how good they are, but also how fans feel about the team this time next year.
All right, fair enough. Appreciate you, Omari. You guys can find him over on Twitter at Omari Sankofa. You can also follow his podcast, Pistons Pulse, with our friend of the podcast, Bryce Simon, as well. You can also follow all of his work over at the Detroit Free Press. Omari, I asked Cody Davis, new Detroit Pistons beat writer at Detroit News, last week on an episode. Just a quick yes or no. Will the Pistons make a trade involving one of the young core by February? Just yes or no?
My guess is yes.
All right, we'll see what happens. All right, Omari, appreciate you coming on, man. Always love having you on, man. We'll have to get you on again soon. I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay safe out there. Thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on any podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe on the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Stay safe out there. Till next time, peace out.